Long ago, on the Pacific coast, a canoe crew paddles in concert across the long, open channel to the mainland. The chief and crew are anxious as they traverse the waters. In most years, the waters beneath their canoe would be teeming with fish, otters, and seals. But the water had warmed this year, and many of the fish were gone. Times at home were tough, but they had heard that conditions on the mainland had been much better and that food could be had there. The chief had relatives by marriage on the mainland that he had generously supplied with flint and shell in the past, and now it was time to call in some favors. He counts the strings of shell beads in his hands nervously, remembering that such favors come at a cost. By mid afternoon, the canoe approaches the town of Shuktoon, a bustling town with hundreds of people and many canoes like his own coming and going. On the shore, the chief of Shuktoon, clad in her distinctive otterskin cape, is waiting with members of the Brotherhood and several women carrying baskets of acorns, berries, and even dried meat. As they come to the shore and beach the canoe, the Brotherhood unloads their cargo while the crew and their chief are led to the town to spend the evening. After proper and official greetings, the two chiefs formalize the exchange. He hands her the strings of prized shell beads that will cover the cost of the supplies and their loading. With business out of the way, the two chiefs share news and discuss the upcoming festival that is keeping everyone busy and that will summon many more people from all over the coast. After the sun sets and the night air cools, he is shown to a large house where he and his crew can sleep. His mind drifts to the plans for the next morning, when he and his crew will depart for the islands with their precious cargo that will hopefully see them through the rest of the season until the seals return to the islands. It's a long trip, but he's thankful for his mainland relatives that can alleviate the hardship of his village. Thinking of his home back on the islands, he closes his eyes and falls asleep. This is a glimpse into the world of the ancient Chumash people, the indigenous inhabitants of the Santa Barbara Channel area and the outlying islands. Even today, the Chumash people still live in the land of their ancestors, and archaeology shows that they've likely been there for over 10,000 years. That fact alone speaks to the Chumash's ability to thrive in this area. These were not simple people struggling to eke out a living. In fact, they were so successful that they achieved a very impressive degree of sophistication and complexity. They lived in large settlements headed by chiefs and elite societies, used currency, operated guilds, and maintained extensive trade connections between the coast, interior, and the islands with the aid of large ocean going canoes. In today's episode, we're going to turn our attention to the remarkable Chumash people and their culture. Hope you're ready. Okay, as is custom, we need to talk about sources for this episode. How do we know what we know about the Chumash? While our sources are not complete and don't answer every question out there, we are fortunate to have lots of excellent sources about the ancient Chumash. First, the Chumash are not extinct, but still very much alive and well, and many of them still live in their ancestral land carrying on their legacy. There are even multiple museums and cultural centers run by Chumash groups, which is really awesome. Many Chumash individuals have historically worked with ethnographers to preserve details of their ancient culture. We also have accounts written by the Spanish from the 16th century onwards, and these are important because they help scholars understand Chumash culture before colonization. It's worth noting that these early Spanish encounters occurred on the coast, and most of their records focus much more on the coast and island Chumash and less on the interior Chumash. Now, contact with the Spanish had a big impact on the Chumash. By the late 18th and early 19th century, a series of Spanish missions were founded along the California coast to Christianize the local native population, and most of the Chumash were relocated there, sometimes by force. Although this was incredibly disruptive and traumatic to the Chumash people and their culture, the Spanish authorities at the missions kept detailed baptismal and marriage records, and those records can actually shed a lot of light on the relationships that different communities and people had with one another, and have been very valuable for researchers. Finally, we have archaeology, and luckily for us, there is a rich body of archaeological work that goes back nearly 150 years in the Santa Barbara area. Many archaeological sites have been documented and even linked to settlements named in historical sources. Unfortunately, development and human activity have threatened these sites over the last few centuries. However, that's not the case across the channel on the Channel Islands. The islands have provided archaeologists with many important archaeological sites because of their limited development, thanks to being designated as a national park, and because there are no burrowing animals on the island to disturb any sites. As we'll see, the islands have furnished archaeologists with lots of important archaeological data. One last thing we need to discuss is chronology. I'm not going to lie, the chronology was a little frustrating because several chronologies have been proposed, and chronology charts often end up looking like this monstrosity. My grumbles aside, the chronologies do have a lot of overlap, which is nice. They all divide Chumash history into early, middle, late, and historic periods. Although there's disagreement about where these begin and end and how they break into smaller chronological components. In the interest of simplicity, I'm going to use a simplified version based on a few recent chronologies, which will suit our purposes today. I hope you'll forgive me for leaving out the finer points between the early YB and early Z transition. Thus, the chronology is going to look like this, and it'll help anchor our discussion. Please keep in mind that this chronology is only canon in the Ancient America's extended universe. In real life academic literature, this would be a lot more detailed. With all that out of our way, we need to acquaint ourselves with the world that the Chumash inhabited, the Santa Barbara Channel area, including the northern Channel Islands. The Chumash lands can be divided into three general areas: the interior, the coast, and the islands. This is important because geography created many differences between the Chumash. They were divided into different groups speaking distinct but related Chumashan languages, although they shared a common culture. But back to our geographical survey. The first area, the interior, is characterized by mountainous terrain broken by small valleys that support various scrub, chaparral, and where rivers are present, forests. Those forests tend to be dominated by oaks, sycamores, bay trees, and wild cherries. Oaks, in particular, were very important as a source of nuts and acorns, which could be gathered and eaten or stored for later use. Large and small game such as deer, squirrels, rabbits, and rodents were also common in the interior. The second area, the coast, is comparatively cooler with milder seasons and a Mediterranean climate. The coastal mainland has many of the same resources as the interior, though in different proportions, but also access to many marine resources. The Santa Barbara Channel is an extraordinarily productive marine area. This is an area with rich kelp beds that are home to many fish, mollusks, and marine mammals. Not only were these valuable food sources, but marine mammals provided valuable skins and furs, while shellfish provided shells that were used for crafting. The last area, the Northern Channel Islands, in contrast to the mainland coast, have a cooler climate and much lower terrestrial biodiversity. There's no deer, rabbits, or squirrels on the islands. The biggest animal is the island fox, and it's likely an introduced species by ancient people. The vegetation on the islands is characterized by chaparral, sage scrub, grasslands, and pine forests. While we're discussing the islands, it's important to note that the Chumash only inhabited the northern four islands you see on the map. The southern islands were inhabited by the Tongva, and they are not our topic today. Overall, this was an area of abundance and variety, and it's worth highlighting a few resources here. First, the Chumash had access to several sources of asphaltum, commonly known as bitumen or tar. This was used by the Chumash as a sealant, adhesive, or applique, and we'll see its uses later in the episode. Second, the Chumash had access to good quality lithics such as shale and sandstone, but more importantly, Monterey chert, which was used for most tools. Overall, the Chumash were lucky to live in an area where they had everything they needed to make a good living. Let's turn our attention to the origins and development of the Chumash, starting in the terminal Pleistocene. I mentioned in the introduction that the Chumash have been here for over 10,000 years, and that's not hyperbole or exaggeration. There's no evidence for any sort of population displacement or replacement. A 2006 mitochondrial DNA study suggested that the Chumash had an ancient presence in Southern California and that they might be among the oldest humans to arrive in the Americas. On that note, let's go way back to when humans first began migrating to the Americas. Now, back then, the Santa Barbara coast looked much different than it does today. During this time, glaciers covered a lot of North America, and sea levels were much lower than they are today. As you can see in my crude recreation, the Northern Channel Islands were actually a single island called Santa Rosa that was much closer to the mainland. Close enough, in fact, that Columbian mammoths were able to cross over and inhabit the island. Over time, these giants evolved into pygmy mammoths, which are just the cutest little fun sized mammoths you ever did see. Sadly, they went extinct either just before or just as humans arrived. The current evidence is inconclusive for those who are curious. But back to the people. For those who have seen our episode on human migration into the Americas, you'll know that a coastal route from Asia to the Americas is increasingly seen as the most viable early route for human migration into the continents. With that in mind, it makes sense that the rich coastline and outlying Channel Islands would theoretically be an important area in this migration. And let me tell you, the archaeology there does not disappoint. The Channel Islands have some very early dates, including the earliest human remains ever documented in North America. Those remains belong to the Arlington Springs man, or woman, there's been some debate on the sex of the individual, but they date back to a whopping 13,000 years ago. The fact that they were discovered on the islands is also proof that these early Paleo Indians had boats and were well adapted to a maritime environment. Now, if you want to push human occupation here further back still, the site of Daisy Cave on San Miguel Island has chert flakes and a bone bead associated with burned soil and charred wood that was dated back to 18,000 years ago. But those dates are hotly contested. Maybe someday those dates will be confirmed, who knows? However, there are several Paleo Indian sites dated between 12,000 and 8,000 years ago, and these paint an interesting picture of the earliest inhabitants of the Channel Islands. Now, it should be stated that most of these sites are small campsites or seasonal middens that leave much unknown. The most famous tools from the Pleistocene Channel Islands are the Channel Island Amole and Channel Island barbed points. These crescent shaped points are impressively napped and similar to other points in the Western stemmed tradition, an early pre Clovis lithic tradition. Now, those early coastal inhabitants also crafted many other scrapers, choppers, and flake tools with local chert. Many of these points are believed to be used for hunting and fishing, but the best evidence of fishing comes from several bone gorges that are believed to be fishing gorges. Shellmans from this period show that shellfish were regularly consumed. In rare cases, these sites have grinding tools that were likely used for plant processing. At Daisy Cave, which we mentioned earlier, charred remains of plants and starchy bulbs were recovered that dated back to this time period, which suggests a reliance on carbohydrate rich plants, which, interestingly, would have balanced a diet rich in shellfish. These paleo sites have even produced remains of red ochre and shell beads, which can give us a glimpse into the life of these early inhabitants. Shell beads in particular are going to be a big deal down the line. We also know that exchange was already occurring between the islands and the mainland and even more distant areas. At the site of CASRI 512 on Santa Rosa Island, an obsidian flake was recovered that was later sourced to the Coso Range in the California interior, over 300 kilometers or 150 miles away. During the terminal Pleistocene, we can see recently arrived people enjoying the bounty of the land and sea with little competition and quickly acclimating to their surroundings. From what we can tell, these were egalitarian people living a mobile lifestyle, moving seasonally to the most productive areas. It was a good life, and they thrived during this time. Unfortunately, Mother Earth had her own plans. Around 10,000 years ago, the Earth began to warm and the glaciers began to melt. For the Chumash, this had some pretty immediate consequences. Santa Rosa began to slip beneath the water, which divided the island into the four northern islands. Rest in peace, Santa Rosa. Your memory will always live on in our hearts. The early Holocene is one of transition, and this set the stage for important future developments. At about 6000 BCE, at the start of the early period, those finely crafted Channel Island amoles and barbs disappeared and were replaced by more expedient chipped stone tools. Shellfish and starchy plants continued to be a very important part of the diet, but there's a slow shift during this time to a more sedentary lifestyle. To be clear, populations were still mobile, but they tended to frequent the same productive areas. This shift can be seen in cemeteries that have been excavated on the Channel Islands. These contain elaborate burials with shell beads, bone tools, and other offerings. And the fact that these cemeteries were regularly returned to and used suggests that people were forming relationships with specific geographic locations. Houses also begin to appear in the archaeological record during the early period after 4000 BCE, showing that some of these sites were used persistently. By the end of the early period, there were communities living in the same spot year round. A good example is the site of CASMI 87 at Keeler Harbor on San Miguel Island. This is a large site, and the huge amounts of tool debris, food remains, and other materials show that this was a permanent settlement by 500 BCE. We also see some other important developments as well. One worth noting is the appearance of mortar and pestles, which some scholars have argued is evidence of acorn consumption and processing. Obviously, this is circumstantial evidence, but many indigenous people in California relied heavily on acorns, so there's an argument to be made. Another development we see is the emergence of fire regimes. Charcoal deposits in certain areas increased noticeably during the early period, and this is likely the result of human agency. We know in historical times that the Chumash, like many other people in the Americas, burned the landscape to make it more productive by encouraging the growth of economically and culturally important plants. If all that sounds fascinating, check out our most recent episode on indigenous fire regimes. By the Middle Period, development really starts to ramp up. During this time, the Chumash population started to increase dramatically. Archaeology shows that more villages were popping up and fishing activities were intensifying. Unfortunately, this appears to have put a strain on the Chumash population and their resources. Examination of human remains show that average body size was decreasing and that poor health was becoming increasingly common. Oddly enough, in other places, these traits can be associated with the adoption of agriculture, but the Chumash never adopted agriculture. They likely would have been familiar with farming due to their limited dealings with the Mojave of the California desert, but never got aboard the maize train. People on the coast and islands appear to have focused their efforts on extracting food from the sea, and it's noteworthy that on the islands, villages moved to the coast, while inland villages were either depopulated or abandoned. During this period, there are some important technologies that appear in the archaeological record, directly or indirectly, and we need to call these out. First, the bow and arrow was adopted by the Chumash, and while this was a valuable hunting tool, its arrival also corresponds to an increase in violence. Second, we have the invention of the plank canoe, or as the Chumash call them, Tomols, and we need to stop and talk about these for a minute because they were a big freaking deal. As we mentioned earlier, the Chumash were very familiar with boats and were well adapted to the water for millennia. Based on ethnographic evidence, before the invention of the plank canoe, the Chumash appear to have used two types of boats: reed boats and dugouts. Small reed craft could be quickly made from local tool reeds, and these were capable enough for channel crossings in calm weather and for coastal fishing. The drawbacks to these were their small size, their limited carrying capacity, their vulnerability to rough seas, and their tendency to waterlog. References to dugouts are very rare, but from what we can gather, it seems that these were made from a hollowed out poplar, willow, or cottonwood log. The same sources suggest that these were restricted to use in estuaries, coves, and calm seas. They would not have been very seaworthy, and conditions in the channel could get dangerous quickly. The Tomol addressed many of these shortcomings with a radical new design. The Tomol was created from sewn redwood planks. Now, if you go to Santa Barbara today, you won't see any redwoods, and you wouldn't have seen any 2,000 years ago. So, how did the Chumash get redwood? As it turns out, they would collect it from driftwood that was carried south by ocean currents. These wood fragments would be seasoned, shaped into planks, and sanded before being bound together with milkweed string. Next, the Tomol had to be waterproof, and this was done with a special mixture of asphaltum and pine pitch. Tomols ranged from between 3.5 to 9 meters or 12 to 30 feet, and they were proper ocean-going canoes. Unlike the dugouts and reed boats we discussed earlier, these could carry up to 8 to 12 people, or 2 tons of cargo. The Tomol not only allowed for safer transportation and bulk carrying, but it also allowed the Chumash to pursue deep water fish such as tuna, swordfish, and sharks. We'll talk about the social implications of these canoes a little later. It's worth keeping in mind that reed boats and dugouts were still used alongside Tomols into the historic period. The Tomol didn't entirely replace them. But before we leave Tomols, there's a bit of controversy that I'd like to address. Some scholars have suggested that Tomols are not actually a Chumash invention, but a Polynesian one, or perhaps a product of Polynesian inspiration. For those who saw our episode on the Polynesian exchange, you'll know that there's increasingly compelling evidence that Polynesians traveled across the Pacific and reached the Americas. In that episode, we pretty much stuck to the southern hemisphere in our discussion of Polynesian American contact. But there's also a theory that Polynesians reached the coast of California from Hawaii, and upon reaching the Santa Barbara coast, they either taught the Chumash how to make their plank canoes or inspired them to make similar watercraft. Supporters have argued that the development of the Tomol in the Santa Barbara Channel coincides with the period of Polynesian expansion and exploration across the Pacific. This, understandably, is very provocative and controversial, and as interesting as this idea is, there's actually far more evidence against it. In 2007, Jean Arnold wrote an excellent critique of this theory and brought a lot of good evidence to bear. While we won't get into all of it, she demonstrated that Tomols were being used around 500 CE, several centuries before Polynesians ever reached the Hawaiian Islands. It's also worth keeping in mind that the same circumstances and constraints that prompted the Polynesians to create their plank canoes were also present in Southern California, and that this is likely an example of parallel development. If all that sounds interesting and you want the nitty gritty details, I highly recommend looking up her article in the bibliography. All this appears to have had a profound impact on Chumash culture and its development, because around 1150, at the opening of the appropriately named Transitional Period, things appear to have gotten pretty turbulent. There's an increase in violence, likely aided by the arrival of the bow and arrow. There's also signs of environmental changes such as droughts and changes in the water temperature of the channel. All of this forced Chumash culture and society to change and adapt. And by the end of the transitional period around 1300, Chumash society had transformed and gained a very sophisticated degree of complexity that involved a hierarchical society, a vibrant economy, and wealth. In particular, elite Tomol owners appear to have come out of the transitional period with a lot of power and influence. How exactly this complexity emerged has been a hot topic for decades and will likely remain one for a very long time. Seriously, every book I read on the Chumash devoted many pages to this question. To be clear, the Chumash are not the only complex hunter-gatherers that get this treatment. There are others out there that have prompted discussions about the emergence of their social and political complexity. Looking at you, Calusa and peoples of the Pacific Northwest. We could be here discussing these theories for a long time, but instead, we're going to hit the highlights. One popular theory is that during this transitional period, ocean temperatures in the channel warmed, which decreased marine productivity, and that people had to coalesce around the remaining productive areas, and that this drove increasing hierarchy and exchange by allowing elites to amass more power and influence. Certain elites, especially those with Tomols, may have been in positions to control exchange and food distribution, and may have used these tough times as an opportunity to aggrandize themselves or to seize control of certain ritual activity and social networks. Other scholars have gone the opposite route and argued that late Chumash society arose not from scarcity, but rather from prosperity. They claim that prosperity allowed elites to amass wealth and to create exchange networks with other Chumash groups, which would have been very advantageous in times of economic hardship. Others have argued that conflict among the Chumash during the transitional period led to village elites consolidating power to prevent conflict. And indeed, archaeology does show that the transitional period was a time of increased violence in the Chumash area. A few contrarian scholars have dismissed these theories and pointed out that the changes in the transitional period are simply just a continuation of developments that had already been in motion centuries before. This is a very roundabout way of saying that the exact causes behind the development of the late Chumash are not fully understood, though certainly not for lack of trying. Another important development during this transitional period is the use of shell beads as an exchange medium. As we've already seen, shell beads were nothing novel in of themselves. The Chumash and their ancestors were experts in using shells to craft many different types of beads and tools from different shells. Shell beads show up in some of the earliest archaeology in the area and were used for thousands of years. In the transitional and late period, however, they began to be used in a new way. The shell beads we're talking about here were specifically made from the shell of the purple olivella and were made with a very specific cupped design. During the transitional period, production of these shell beads and the microdrills used to make them increased dramatically. In one archaeological analysis of the Channel Island shell industry, shell bead detritus at one island site increased by an insane 400 to 700% during the transitional period, and still increased further during the late period. The islands in particular were a big hub of shell bead manufacturing, which was aided by large chert deposits that could be used to manufacture micro drills to drill these out. This provided them with an important export that they could trade with their coastal neighbors on the mainland. It's extremely likely that these beads were being manufactured by specialists. So, what were all these shell beads used for? Believe it or not, they were used as a medium of exchange. Basically, they were Chumash currency. These shells had fixed value and could be exchanged for many different goods and services. In the 1850s, Daniel Hill witnessed these beads in use. Note that his reference to the white mussels is probably an error and that he's almost certainly referring to the olivella beads.
These articles were exchanged for a species of money from the Indian mint of the Santa Barbara rancherias, called by them ponga. This description of money consisted of pieces of rounded shell, with a hole in the middle, made from the hardest part of the small, edible white mussel of our shores, which was brought in canoes by the barbarians from the island of Santa Rosa. The worth of a real was put on a string, which passed twice and a half around the hand, i.e., from end of middle finger to wrist. 8 of these strings passed for the value of a silver dollar, and the Indians always preferred them to silver, even prior to 1833. This traffic the Padres encouraged, as it brought them into peaceable intercourse with the tribes of the Tulare Valley.
It's also worth noting that Hill states that these beads were also used in trade with the neighboring Yokuts in the Central Valley. Indeed, these beads can be found as far east as Arizona. Most scholars agree that the Chumash had a market economy, but as we'll see later, there were mechanisms of redistribution. Now, some of you may be wondering how the value of these beads were maintained. How come people didn't just mint their own money in their own backyard and crash the economy? This is an interesting question with a few possible answers. Shell beads were removed from circulation in a few ways. These could be destroyed as part of certain ceremonies and also buried with their owners. I know they say that you can't take it with you after you die, but if you were the ancient Chumash, you totally could. Gene Arnold also theorizes that the supply of shell beads was tightly controlled by elites on the Channel Islands, who would have also controlled canoe access and thus transportation off the island, but this is difficult to verify with archaeology. These mechanisms made sure that shell beads and other luxury items stayed in demand and retained value. This helped facilitate trade and exchange among the Chumash. If someone needed a canoe, materials, or services, shell beads were an accepted currency, and this allowed the Chumash to easily assist each other whenever resource shortages hit a certain area, just like we saw in the introduction. All of these developments bring us at last to the late period, the classic Chumash, if you will. Let's take a look at the Chumash themselves by analyzing their society. Chumash society is known among its admirers for its complexity and sophistication. Society was divided into different ranks: chiefs, elites, and commoners, and for the most part, one's status was ascribed at birth. Most scholars agree that Chumash society was organized around clans that trace their ancestry through matrilineal descent. Matrilocal residence appears to have been practiced after a couple got married, meaning that the husband would live with the family of his wife. That said, this doesn't appear to have been universal, and there are instances of patrilocal residence, particularly for high-ranking members of society. The Chumash appear to have had gender roles, but these were fairly flexible. While women typically took on many domestic roles such as basket making and food preparation, historical accounts record that they could also wield considerable wealth and power, independent from their husbands, something that archaeology has corroborated. Many excavated cemeteries have richly adorned burials of Chumash women, and some cemeteries, like the historical site of Umaluo, have almost as many rich female burials as male burials. But how were the Chumash organized and ruled? We're going to answer that by looking at the Chumash hierarchy. At the top of Chumash society was the Wat, the chief. Chiefs were responsible for organizing events, especially feasts, maintaining food and material stores, overseeing other officials, and caring for visitors and the poor. They were distinguished by their otter skin capes, long flint knives, feathers in their hair, and a small armed retinue. Chiefs were typically male, but there are multiple recorded instances of female chiefs in the historical record. According to Spanish reports, each village had at least one chief, but larger ones could have multiple. The power and authority of a chief could vary dramatically depending on his or her wealth and influence. On the islands and coast, an important part of a chief's power was his ownership over canoes, which gave them immense influence over passage and trade between different coastal and island communities. Chiefs that had authority over multiple villages and settlements were referred to as temi or pakwat, and in addition to the aforementioned responsibilities, they had the power to mobilize warriors in times of conflict. Warfare between various Chumash villages is well attested in sources, and these could be quite destructive at times. Chiefs were part of a local society called the Antap, which was a formal institution made of other elites and religious specialists. All members were initiated into the association as children, and families had to pay a hefty fee to get their kids in. The Antap had important religious and ceremonial responsibilities. They provided chiefs with advice on matters legal, religious, and economic, maintained all necessary ritual paraphernalia, cured illnesses, and ensured cosmic balance to the best of their abilities. It's been suggested that on-top societies were an important mechanism of social integration between the elites of various communities. If this is the case, it would have been a valuable channel of communication between different areas and would have facilitated economic and political corroboration. So, who were the other members of the on-top society? Let's meet some of these colorful characters, starting with the Paha or Alpaha. The Paha was the second in command after the chief and helped them manage public and private ceremonies. It was their job to make sure that attendees provided the necessary gifts for a ceremony or feast, that said gifts were delivered to the chief, and that dancers and performers at ceremonies got appropriately compensated. Sources indicate that the Paha got a cut of these transactions, so they were people of considerable wealth and influence. So much so that in the event of a chief's death, the Paha would take over until a successor was chosen. The chief also had another important assistant called the Altipatishwi. Now, this is going to get a little weird, so brace yourself. The Altipatishwi is sometimes referred to as the poisoner, and his identity was kept a secret for reasons that will become obvious. On paper, this person was a keeper of herbs that they would wear at ceremonies, but this individual also had a pretty sordid job. The Altipatishwi would secretly select a wealthy individual ahead of a ceremony and poison them slowly. Over the next few months, the poisoner would extract large sums of money and goods from the person until they were either cured or they died. Any goods collected from this marked man would be divided among the chiefs, pahas, and the poisoner. I'm not going to lie, I was a little skeptical when I first read this, but my source on this stressed that multiple Chumash informants that were interviewed for this account widely believed that this practice existed, so these people clearly had a reputation. That said, it's impossible to say how frequently this was practiced. Maybe this was more of a scare tactic to make sure that wealthy individuals paid their ceremonial dues. Either way, I can't say for sure, so make of it what you will. While we're here, it's worth making a small detour to discuss feasts and ceremonies. These could be held to celebrate various rites of passage, such as the birth of a child, one's coming of age, weddings, and funerals. They could also commemorate regular calendar events. The most significant annual ceremonies were the Hutash, which celebrated the fall harvest, and the Kakunupmawa, which commemorated the winter solstice. These feasts and ceremonies would feature singers and dancers, some of whom were elaborately costumed. In 1926, at a cemetery in Winchester Canyon, a beautiful inlaid swordfish skull was excavated in a burial, and it's likely that this was part of an elaborate swordfish costume that a dancer wore. We know from Chumash traditions that the swordfish was, and still is, a very important fish in the culture, so this discovery was very noteworthy. I couldn't find any pictures or recreations of this, so you'll have to use your imagination this time. Not only were these feasts a good excuse to relax and celebrate with friends and kin, but they also provided elites ways to redistribute wealth, create new alliances, reaffirm old relationships, and strengthen those communal bonds. These feasts involved large quantities of stored food, or special delicacies that would have been served in prestigious vessels or with luxurious implements. Some of these vessels were made of imported steatite from Santa Catalina Island to the south. These would have been destroyed as part of the ceremony, and archaeology has found several examples of oyas, bowls, and mortars in excavations at various Chumash sites. Several Spanish accounts also note the lavish feasts and abundance of food that impressed them, and it's likely that the hosts were making efforts to form alliances with the Spanish. But back to the on top. Another important religious figure that deserves a mention is the Alchuklash. The Alchuklash was a shaman and astrologer who determined phases of the sun and moon, foretold the future, called for rain and good weather, but also took a role in curing illness and administering tobacco and toloake, a potent entheogen. They were also in charge of tracking the calendar so that the community knew when to schedule ceremonies like the Kakanutmawa. Shamans and doctors were powerful people in Chumash society that commanded a degree of respect and fear. On one hand, they could use their powers to intercede within the spirit realm for the good of their community, but on the other hand, they could also wield such powers malevolently. Chumash oral traditions also say that the Alchuklash were also responsible for some of the most dazzling Chumash rock art. These brightly colored pictographs are, simply put, dazzling, and they speak to the incredible artistic ability of the Chumash. In this example from Painted Cave, you can see an array of mandala like wheels, colored bands, and human figures. There are many examples of painted rock outcrops, many of which were painted with petroglyphs of animals, people, and abstract designs. Those same traditions state that these painted rocks were places of shamanic rituals, where the shaman could leave the earthly realm and enter the spiritual realm. One last group of influential figures worth mentioning were the Aki. The Aki were undertakers, whose job was to dig graves for the dead. I know that sounds like a dead end job, pun intended, but these were honored and valued members of Chumash society and were very well compensated for their services. The position of Aki was held by very specific people, older postmenopausal women, or by two-spirit individuals. Two-spirit refers to an additional gender variant that several indigenous cultures recognize, and in the case of the Aki, a biological male would dress and do the work of a postmenopausal woman, in this instance, grave digging. All these political and religious leaders fulfilled important roles and ensured that their communities maintained social cohesion. Now, the On-Top was not the only powerful society among the Chumash. Another influential group of people in Chumash society were the builders of the Tomols. As we've already mentioned, Tomol construction was a highly specialized and prized craft. People who had the skills and expertise to build canoes were few and highly sought after, and so these craftsmen did what any specialist in a pre-industrial society does. They came together and created a guild called the Automolish, often rendered in English as the Brotherhood of the Tomol, which gets full marks from me for having an awesome name. This craft guild ensured that the skills necessary to make Tomols remained closely guarded trade secrets, and so they essentially became the one-stop Tomol shop. Tomols could only be commissioned by wealthy individuals, and the Brotherhood ensured that only their members could build these boats. Ethnographies stress that conditions on the sea could be quite dangerous, and that a well-made Tomol with an experienced crew could be all the difference between survival and a watery grave, so this was taken very seriously by the Chumash. The Brotherhood's activities were not just limited to canoe construction. They also operated as sea traders that would transport goods between the mainland and islands and load and unload cargo, for which they were compensated. That said, it's important to keep in mind that most Chumash would have been commoners that made a living by fishing, hunting, and foraging. Some commoners may have also been craft specialists producing goods for the elite. As we mentioned earlier, bead making was practically a full-blown industry on the islands, and other people could specialize in other crafts such as basketry or tool making. Now let's turn our attention to domestic affairs. Where exactly did the Chumash live and what did their communities look like? The Chumash lived in permanent villages and towns that could vary quite a bit in size. Most were small, with a population between 10 and 300 people, but the largest could approach nearly 1,000 people. According to Spanish reports, the Goleta Slough had a population in the late 18th century between 1,500 and 2,000 along its rich estuaries. However, the average village typically had about 10 to 25 houses with about 10 or more people each. Many Chumash houses have been excavated, and so archaeologists can confirm their size. For example, Petus Point, a small site that was occupied in the middle to late period, has several houses that have been excavated that are each approximately 9 meters or 30 feet in diameter. We actually have a great description of a large Chumash house, or op, penned by Father Juan Crespi in 1769 while he was on a Spanish expedition.
This chief, after a long while, invited us to come to his village, and we went over. He showed us over his whole village, where all the house roofs were piled thick with barbecued fish, or in other cases, fish of the sort they had brought us, being dried. Some of the houses are extremely large. For curiosity's sake, we went inside some of them and were struck with wonder at their size, for without any doubt at all, they must be able to lodge 60 persons and more without hindrance. They have hurdles about a yard and a half in height, such that we imagined that they must sleep off the floor. There were women distributed among various lodgings within these houses, some of whom were grinding for gruel, others toasting the seeds, and others making baskets and bowls, made so finely out of rushes, with such patterns and pictures as to strike one with wonder.
Now, villages weren't just houses, there were other buildings and amenities in them. Villages had large open air plazas surrounded by poles or mats that were used as dance grounds for ceremonial events. These areas, in turn, had small fenced off areas that served as sacred enclosures that were used by religious initiates. Storage facilities like granaries and smokehouses allowed the Chumash to store and stockpile foods, and this is part of what allowed the Chumash to maintain such dense populations. Some communities had special huts built for menstruation and childbirth. One special building that was very important was the sweat lodge. Sweat lodges were built by erecting a hemispherical frame over a semi subterranean pit that was later covered in earth. These came in a small version, an uxtalulu, or a larger one called an apayik. The larger ones were typically reserved for the elites, specifically for members of the Antap, and were used for various ceremonial purposes. A good description of these comes from Father Pedro Font during an expedition in 1776.
They also have a common temescal. This is a hot, closed room for sweating, made somewhat subterranean and very firm with poles and earth, and having at the top, in the middle, an opening like a scuttle to afford air and serve as a door, through which they go down inside by a ladder, consisting of straight poles set in the ground and joined together, one being shorter than the other. I peeped into a temescal and perceived a strong heat coming up from it. In the middle of them, they make a fire. The Indians enter to perspire, seated all around, and as soon as they perspire freely and wet the ground with their sweat, they run out and jump into the sea, which is close by, to bathe themselves.
Sure sounds fun. I'm sure my Scandinavian viewers and sauna fans know the satisfaction well. For those who are curious on population estimates for the Chumash as a whole, they typically fall between 15,000 and 25,000 at contact, with 18,000 or 20,000 being the usual number you'll see. But those are just estimates, and they may change with additional research. With that, many people may be wondering how the Chumash were keeping so many people fed and healthy. Remember, these are people who eschewed agriculture and still maintained very dense populations. Sustenance depended a lot on location. The coastal and island Chumash made great use of marine resources, particularly fish, mollusks, and sea mammals. The channel area is an extremely productive marine ecosystem. The kelp beds in this area are home to at least 125 species of fish, so if you can't get enough of your local church's fish fry, this would have been a great area to be in. The coastal and island Chumash fished many different kinds of fishes, such as halibut, rays, mackerel, rockfish, and sardines. These could be dried out, smoked, and stored for future use. With the introduction of the Tomol, the Chumash could more reliably access larger pelagic fish in deeper waters, such as tuna, swordfish, and shark. Fish could be caught with either harpoons, fishing lines, or nets. A very common artifact found in Chumash archaeology are fish hooks carved from shell, and these attest to the importance of fishing in Chumash culture. Speaking of shells, marine mollusks were another important food source. California oysters and little neck clams, as well as various types of scallops, abalone, and mussels, were hunted. These were not only delicious and nutritious, but also provided valuable crafting material in the form of shells. On a similar note, marine mammals such as otters, seals, and sea lions and dolphins were hunted by different Chumash groups. And not only did these provide meat, but they also provided valuable skins and hides. Otters in particular were sought after for their pelts. Even though marine fauna dominated most Chumash diets, other animals were hunted as well. On the coast and interior, the Chumash would have had access to small game like squirrels, skunks, rabbits, and foxes, as well as deer, and these were more prevalent on the interior. Remember that none of these land mammals would have been present on the Channel Islands except for foxes. Based on faunal remains and archaeology, birds appear to have not been a significant part of the diet, but various waterfowl such as ducks, gulls, pelicans, and cormorants were occasionally consumed. Turning our attention to plants, the Chumash made use of a wide variety of plants for food. We need to give some special attention to acorns. Acorns were a terrific food source and could be stored for long periods of time, so in winter months when many fish were absent from the channel waters, acorns could pick up the slack. Now, acorns can't be eaten raw. I mean, you can if you're Bear Grylls or a masochist, but for everyone else, the bitter and potentially toxic tannins need to be leached with water first, but afterwards they can be ground into a flour that can be used to make different foods. Berries such as elderberry and tanyan berries were consumed too. Other plants like tarweed, chia, blue dix, meadow barley, and many others were regularly gathered and consumed as well. But plants also had very important utilitarian uses as well. Plant materials were used to make nets, mats, bags, and cordage. We've already seen that milkweed was used to sew Tomol planks together. Perhaps the most important items made from plant fibers, though, were baskets. These could be crafted from various shoots, roots, and rushes. Chumash baskets were extremely important for storage and food preparation because the Chumash did not use pottery until after European contact. Baskets preserve very poorly in archaeology, so there are very few examples of ancient Chumash basketry, but this is a tradition that has been preserved by modern Chumash people, and these baskets are no less beautiful and artistic than ancient pottery. We know from ethnography and modern Chumash practices that baskets were created using coiling, and that baskets were primarily made by women in the community. These baskets performed many of the same functions that pottery did, and the Chumash even had ways of waterproofing them with bitumen to aid in storage. These could be so watertight, in fact, that they could be used to carry water itself. The Chumash were good at this, and it's a testament to their intimate knowledge of the land and resources around them. In summary, the Chumash were truly masters of their environment, who created a culture that could weather stress remarkably well. Canoes and shell beads allowed goods and materials to be moved around to areas in need. Active leadership and festivals enforced identity and cultural values. However, all that would be put to the test when their splendid isolation from colonial attention would be broken. Around 1534, the Spanish crown commissioned Juan Cabrillo to build a fleet and to explore the Pacific coast from Mexico up north into modern California. In 1542, Cabrillo took his fleet and a few hundred men up the coast, and eventually made landfall on the northern Channel Islands. Now, if Cabrillo was expecting to find a docile people welcoming him with open arms, he was disappointed. There were numerous skirmishes with natives up and down the coast, the Chumash among them. In fact, Cabrillo would die from an infected wound sustained during a rescue mission and would be buried on one of the Channel Islands, likely San Miguel Island. For the next 200 years, the Spanish didn't pay much attention to the Chumash and the California coast, and only a few documented encounters occurred during that time. The Spanish probably realized that the Chumash didn't have any gold or silver worth plundering, and that was probably for the best. Another expedition in 1602 searched for a good site for a port in Southern California, but nothing ever came of it. There were probably moments of undocumented contact from Spanish ships and crews involved in the Manila trade. It's very likely, however, that these encounters may have introduced European diseases to the peoples of California, and this would have taken a heavy toll on their populations. Colonial pressure really stepped up in the second half of the 18th century when the Spanish authorities decided to establish a permanent presence in Southern California to solidify their claims and to prevent other powers from settling there. Between 1769 and 1833, a series of missions and presidios were established throughout California, from San Diego all the way up to the San Francisco Bay Area. In the Chumash lands, missions were established at Sana Buenaventura, modern-day Ventura, La Purísima Concepcion, modern Lompoc, Santa Ynez, modern Santa Ynez, and San Luis Obispo, as well as a presidio that was established at Santa Barbara. At first, the Chumash were actually pretty receptive to the Spanish, and many chiefs spared no expense in pressing the Spanish with feasts and entertainment. In the long run, however, the missions forever changed the Chumash. The presence of the Spanish made the traditional Chumash way of life increasingly difficult. Cattle grazing consumed plants, acorns, seeds, and other plant foods that the Chumash had relied on for millennia. Fur trappers and seal hunters arrived soon after and began destroying the otter and seal populations. Diseases and epidemics also took heavy tolls on the Chumash. In some Chumash communities, the population declined by 2/3 in only 25 years. Despite this, many Chumash continued to live their traditional lives as best they could, and the fact that this persisted as long as it did is really impressive. The Chumash never adopted agriculture and continued making the same craft items that they had for centuries. Certain Spanish goods were adopted during this time. This can be seen in the many iron tools that appear in the archaeological record. Beads started to be made with iron needles, and these are easy to spot in archaeology because the bead holes get much smaller. Thus, the Chumash still retained a lot of agency and could choose which European technologies or customs to adopt when it suited them. For most Chumash, however, these disruptions left them with little choice but to take shelter in the missions, which were rife with disease, abusive labor, and disenfranchisement. At first, the Chumash could live in their own settlements under the guidance of the mission authorities, but in 1803, the Spanish viceroy declared that the natives had to live in the missions, and slowly all the Chumash were gathered in. By the late 1820s, the last inhabitants of the Channel Islands were moved to the missions on the mainland. Life in the missions was very difficult, and major epidemics tore through the native populations and left many Chumash dead. Now, we should point out that the Chumash didn't take all of this lying down. They resisted, most famously in 1824, when a coordinated revolt broke out across several missions. A few were even completely taken over by the Chumash. After a few skirmishes, the Spanish drove most of the Chumash into the hills, where survival proved too challenging. The offer of a full pardon from Spanish authorities brought them back to the missions, and Chumash confinement continued. That is until 1835, when the newly independent Mexican government confiscated the mission properties, which in theory should have been held in trust for the benefit of the Chumash and other natives, but were later sold off or given to private citizens. However, this still allowed the remaining Chumash to once again form their own communities. Now, this wasn't some restoration of the good old days. Those times were long gone, and most still worked in poor conditions for nearby ranches and haciendas. Many of those communities continued to experience decline. When California was annexed by the United States after the Mexican-American War, more Chumash were displaced from their lands, although one reservation in Santa Ynez Valley was set aside for the former Chumash inhabitants of the Santa Ynez Mission. Today, they remain the only federally recognized Chumash tribe, while others continue to lobby for federal recognition. Despite all this, the Chumash have endured and preserved their legacy. In fact, many cities in the area, such as Malibu and Nipomo, take their names from Chumash languages. Since the 20th century, there have also been impressive efforts of cultural revitalization. A few Chumash languages are in the process of being revived. In the past 50 years, the Chumash have begun building Tomols again and making channel crossings as their ancestors did centuries ago. The Chumash are an incredibly fascinating people with an equally fascinating history. They were blessed to live in an environment of abundance, and they made the most of it. Doing so wasn't always easy. This was an area prone to sudden environmental changes, and yet the Chumash created a system where they could rely on each other for survival. Members of the On-Top Society helped maintain complex systems of exchange built off of reciprocity. Tomols and shell beads facilitated this exchange, as well as a common culture. Chumash society is very notable for its unique complexity, despite never adopting agriculture, and it persisted well into historical times. And while the modern Chumash live in a modern society today, they are continuing a presence in California that goes all the way back to some of the earliest inhabitants of North America. I'm sure they'll be here for thousands of years more, and I dare say that the channel is a better and more beautiful place with the Chumash. And that's going to wrap us up for today. Special thanks to my patrons listed here. You guys are the best. If you'd like to join the ranks of these fine individuals and support the show, you can do so on Patreon. The link will be in the description. Also, a quick thanks to the Oak Brook Chumash Indian Museum for helping me with this episode. If you're ever visiting Thousand Oaks, California, pay them a visit and check out the museum. Don't forget to subscribe, like the video, and follow us on Facebook. Take care, and we'll see you in our next episode.